For more on the challenges to fight this inflation and what it means for the next person in charge, we're joined by Garret Martin, Senior Lecturer at the American University School of International Service and Co-Director of the Transatlantic Policy Center. Good to see you, sir. This inflation issue in the UK, how much of an impact is that going to have on who ultimately becomes the leader?
Well, I think it's going to have a major impact. Of course, the UK is not by any stretch of the imagination the only major country dealing with inflation, but it is faring significantly worse than a lot of other major G7 countries. So I think that's putting a significant pressure on sort of living standards of many ordinary citizens of the UK. So I think there's definitely going to be a desire for answers from whoever comes out on top of this leadership challenge.
When you say it's worse than the other G7 and arguably lots of other countries, why is it worse for the UK? What is it about that country that somehow inflation gets exaggerated?
Well, the UK is facing the similar pressures from both the pandemic and, of course, the war in Ukraine that has led to a spike in food prices and energy prices. So in that respect, the UK is no different than other major counterparts. I think what we're seeing to explain the worst performances are deeper structural problems and flaws. I would say, of course, the impact of Brexit, which is an ongoing process, has been a major factor. Brexit has really raised the cost of trading in terms of additional paperwork on the UK. So that's been, I think, a significant issue. The second, I think, has been pressure on wages, sort of stagnation of wages and limited gains in productivity of the UK economy are not new. They predate the pandemic. They've only been exacerbated by the events of the last few years.
Right. And on the rates now, there is some chatter behind the scenes that central banks saying, oh, let's raise rates, that will stamp out inflation. And there's some thought that this is not a demand issue, this is a supply issue. Typically you raise rates to quash demand. And in this particular case, do you think that it's right that the Bank of England, or any central bank for that matter, raise rates as a way to tackle this type of inflation?
Well, to be very fair, I'm not an economist by training, so I'll be careful about what I say. I will add, though, that I think there's certainly pressure on the Bank of England, as there are on other central banks, to be seen to be doing something. I think there was certainly chatter earlier that the Bank of England had been too slow and was not reacting enough. So I think there's certainly pressures in that respect. I think the significant pressure on households in the UK, and specifically on the poorest households, I think is also creating great political pressure to be doing something.
How much of an impact do you think, and Brexit came about before the pandemic, but do you think had there not been Brexit, do you think inflation would be better or worse in the UK?
I think it would certainly be more comparable to its other sort of major counterparts. I think there's certainly significant and serious studies that have shown or that have modeled that the impact on the UK's GDP over 10 to 15 years might be 4 to 5%. So certainly Brexit is a significant factor. I think there's another element which is important for businesses, is the whole saga over Brexit for many years, the uncertainty about how Brexit would play out and how it would end, and how now we still have that uncertainty over Northern Ireland. That's creating a lot of difficulties for businesses. It's not an ideal investing environment where there is so much uncertainty about economic policies. So I think undoubtedly, Brexit is a sort of an X factor that has set the UK apart to a certain degree. And I would add also the fact that the UK is a very open economy, is very dependent on imports of food prices and also imports of energy, is making it particularly vulnerable to the sort of supply chain shocks that we've seen.
Right, and we talked about the potential of Russia, I guess, keeping the pipeline shut off, and of course we talked about food earlier. And as co-director of the Policy Center for Transatlantic, how does Europe view America's policy specifically to Ukraine? Do they view the U.S. as doing enough, too much, or too little?
Well, I think that's a very broad question to answer. I think the important element here is that there are divisions in Europe as to the policy towards Ukraine. I think that's normal. Part of those divisions are historical and geographical. There were differing attitudes towards Russia before the war, and we're seeing that magnified. I think there's generally been a very strong level of cohesion, but there is still some chatter now that we're hearing behind the scenes of what is the end game here. And of course, the end game in terms of the war, how long will the support for Ukraine continue, and is it without limits? That's one element. And I think those divisions or those elements of friction, I think, will play out even more in a more manifest manner in the winter if Russia does indeed try to really sort of shut down all of gas supplies to Europe.
Yeah, and of course, history has taught us that whenever a country starts something or gets involved in a conflict and there's not a clear exit, it gets pretty messy pretty quick. I really appreciate the time. Garret Martin over at the American University of International School of International Service. Thank you so much for taking some time with us today.
Thank you for having me.